Hello everyone, Bag here. Surprise surprise for the guy who makes videos covering the beta leaks, but I somehow knew to wait until 2.6 to drop before making this video as to not otherwise instantly render it as outdated. And rest assured that you can share in that same clairvoyance if you watch my leak videos as they release. Worth a shot. Anyways, as a sequel to the video I made about the simulated universe worlds and which ones are the best to farm, this time I would like to use the same lens to look at the Relic caverns, to see which are the best to farm for the average account. Like last time, we are looking generally for how useful a given set can be. So the name of the game here is being universal. You'll get scored higher if you are a set that can be used widely on your account, rather than if only a couple of units can use the specific buffs. And also, just to clarify, we are looking at the caverns themselves, not just the individual relics. So we will keep in mind the farming experience if one relic is amazing and the other one is hot garbage. Okay, that's enough preamble. Let's get going as there are a lot of caverns to go through. Going in order of where they appear in the handbook, the first set of sets is the Wind set and the Ice set. And unlike the first simulated universe world we looked at, this first cavern is already a bit tricky to analyze. The Wind set, if you don't know, is a great set for supports who spam their ultimates, as even if the wind damage bonus does nothing for them, the action advancing means that they might be able to sneak in an extra turn in a cycle, which is very important for the likes of someone like Sparkle. You do lose out on other potential buffs you could be giving your team, especially for Harmony units who could be using the new 2.6 set, or break supports who could use Watchmaker, but an extra turn is an extra turn, and it's really hard to quantify how useful that can be for a given team. Also, with Apocalyptic Shadow, action advancing takes on a whole new use, as anything that can shave off a bit of action value can drastically improve your run depending on how many ultimates you can pull off. Like, if you're using Fei Xiao, yes, using this set is a huge damage loss compared to her alternatives, but getting full energy when you break the enemy and ulting twice immediately after that can give you enough action advance for it to where that's a trade-off that's worth considering. Anyways, yeah, Wind set is good if not a trade-off worth considering, but the rough part comes with the other set, the Ice set. This set is really just good on, like, nobody, as even ice carries like Jing Liu have other sets that they would rather have. So this cavern as a whole suffers a lot from its existence. I think I will rank this cavern similarly as to how I did with Von Whack in the last video, in that I would recommend it to either be a very quick farming experience, or just a relic fragment investment, rather than something you actually try to farm hardcore for. In that, the cavern itself gets a C, but like with Von Whack, I would recommend getting at least one wind set for your account, as you'll never know how useful it can be depending on who you use. Next, we have the first break set and the physical set, and this cavern is much easier to talk about. Nowadays, the Thief set is pretty thoroughly outclassed by either Iron Cavalry or Watchmaker for carries and supports respectively. So while you can use this as a nice two-piece filler set, farming for a brand new set now just doesn't really make much sense. 3 energy per break is really not worth it unless if you're doing some really niche Pure Fiction builds. As for the physical set, while certain units like Clara or Argenti used to enjoy this set, Argenti moving on to the new 2.6 set means that this is only really optimal for Clara, which is just not really a good look. Nothing much more to say, this cavern just goes straight into the D tier. Now stuff gets a bit more interesting as we have 2 very recognizable sets, Musketeer and Passerby. Musketeer has a very useful 2-piece attack stat, which is very universal as a filler option for most carries. Meanwhile, its 4-piece effect is rather niche, but Dill or the Hunt March do still prefer it over other options. Is it great to farm off this cavern just for them? If you're really focused on making these units as good as they can be, then sure. But it's a bit rough when this set is so niche past its 2-piece effect. I will also say that it is nice that this set and the Thief set can be farmed from the earlier weekly bosses at a reduced cost. So if you really don't care about Passerby, then that is an alternative way to slowly accumulate Musketeer pieces. Overall though, this set's 2-piece attack stat is not nearly as unique as it was when the game first launched, so its very limited pool of characters who want this set makes it a bit painful to farm for. Passerby, then, is an even more niche set, as its 2-piece healing is almost useless, but its skill point at the start of battle can be useful. If you have a specific team in mind that really needs that extra skill point at the start of battle, this set is one of your best avenues to achieve that. But if you have that problem, is farming for an entire set really what you should be doing with your stamina? For 99% of players who don't zero cycle, fights last long enough to where one skill point is rather insignificant compared to other buffing options. Is it nice to have on your account for the few times where it can make a difference? Sure, but I would say it is much less recommendable than something like the Wind set from earlier in that kind of Von Wacky kind of genre of kind of recommendable but only sometimes. I'll put this Cavern in the B tier. It's not great, but depending on who your primary carries are, it might be worth dipping your toes into for a little bit. Now, here we go to where my personal biases will 100% shine through, as we are talking about the Quantum set and the Guard set. I don't know, this set doesn't really have a nickname that people use for it. The Quantum set is the most universal carry set in the entire game, as even if you are not a Quantum unit, any unit can take advantage of the defense shredding, and depending on your team comp, that buff might be more beneficial to a carry than doing 2-piece attack. It is the ultimate filler set. If you have a new carry who you don't have a new set for, just slap Quantum on them and things will work out. So the longer the game goes on and the more times that set scenario occurs for you, the more value you get out of this set, which says nothing about the actual Quantum units who are especially adept at using it. But it's the ultimate filler set in that it's never really the best set for anyone besides those Quantum carries. If you do take the time to farm unique specialized sets for all of your carries, this set loses a lot of value. So in the end, it's more of a question of playstyle on how much you want this set. Me? Well, I have a very well farmed Quantum set that I still use on my Acheron to this day, but that was farmed in a time before all of these new sets came out that rendered a bit more obsolete. With my personal favorite set out of the way, we now go to the Guard set. It's kind of just dog shit, no? Only really Fushuan can make use of it, as it's a tanking set that relies on losing HP, so shielders can't really use it and healers aren't going to be taking the brunt of the team's damage like a preservation unit is designed to do so. But besides 5 energy a turn, it provides no offensive utility, and Fushuan really won't be turning into a completely new unit with 5 energy. Her burst isn't that important. So it's a crap set, meaning that I have to put this Cavern lower. I'll be generous and put it into the B tier, as the Quantum set is my ride or die that I will always defend, and it helps that it will always remain relevant as more Quantum carries will eventually be released. The next Cavern is the Shielding set and the Lightning set. To get it out of the way, the Lightning set is complete garbage and is utterly worthless to farm. It was bad on release and it's only gotten more outclassed since then. I actually farmed a bit of it for Acheron before her kit or her set were even leaked, as I was just really dumb and excited for her. So I actually do have a 2-piece of this set that I use as an alternative to my Quantum set, but I would never recommend others to do the same as I have. The Knight set, on the other hand, is a very niche set for shielders, of which Aventurion is the only real notable one to talk about, as there are only 5 preservation units in the entire game, and Fushuan doesn't even shield. With this, you are trading potential damage for using a more offensive set for him in return for better shields, which I think is a very worthwhile trade-off. Is it worthwhile enough to farm this Cavern fur by itself, however? No, not at all. Use Relic Fragments on it if you really want, but spending stamina on this Cavern is an utter pain. Do not repeat the mistakes I made back in 1.6. Into the D tier it goes. Oh boy, speaking of the D tier, we have the Fire and Imaginary set. You remember what I said about the Lightning set just a bit ago? Well, the Fire set is that, but again, and maybe even slightly worse. I think it might actually be the worst set in the game if we are excluding planers. There is seriously just nothing else to say about it. The Imaginary set can be useful if you have Wilt to help keep up your Imprisoned uptime, but why would you farm for this set for its conditional buffs when Imaginary carries like Dill or Ratio have much easier sets to farm? Just ignore this Cavern. If you weren't around for it, the launch of Star Rail was marred with really crappy caverns to choose from, before we got to the more optimal ones as the game progressed. So as you might have been able to tell with how dreary this video has been so far, there really is not much of a reason to go back to them now as we inch closer to 3.0. On that note, we are out of the 1.0 caverns. Hooray! Now we move to the cavern added in 1.2, housing the HP set and Hackerspace. The HP set would prove very beneficial for HP scaling carries, but as we so far only have Blade to fill that role, it's a bit hard to advocate farming for unless if he is one of your primary carries, kind of like the physical set with Clara. Healers and Fushuans can get by with running fully supporting sets. Wasting an entire 2-piece for a couple substats worth of HP is really not worth it most of the time. On the other hand, Hackerspace used to be the primary supporting set, giving very important speed that gives a lot of the same benefits to the whole team as the Wind set that I outlined earlier, albeit to a lesser extent. However, with the new 1.6 support set, a lot of the users of Hackerspace now instead have an avenue to give damage buffs instead, provided that they can actually proc at least part of the set's effect, meaning that Hackerspace is only really for units who both can't use the Eagle set that well and can't use the new 1.6 set that well. Or units who specifically want to just action advance or speed advance as much as possible, like for example Asta. It's weird because up until recently this was the support set to recommend, but with Eagle, Watchmaker, and now the new 1.6 set, it's lost its universal appeal that it had on its release. If you want to spend time farming it because you are a big speed enjoyer, go ahead, it's still great to have on your account, but I can't hype it up as much as I was able to before. I'll give this Cavern a high B tier. Hackerspace isn't completely obsolete yet as its condition is much easier to fulfill compared to the new 1.6 set, and speed is of course still incredibly important with Apocalyptic Shadow's scoring system. But the HP set is ultimately the deal breaker that gets this Cavern just short of going into the A tier, as it's just too niche for anyone to really farm unless if you are one of the very few players that still wants to seriously invest into their blade. Now, finally, we can get past me trying to justify farming for old caverns for their respective niche scenarios, as Duke and Pioneer are both very strong in their respective niches. First of all, both of their 2-pieces are very strong in their own right. So before we even talk about who these sets are good for, having 2-piece attack and 2-piece follow-up bonus is a great start. While Duke is not always the best for follow-uppers, with Valoris giving it some competition for specific users, in general it is an amazing set to farm if your account is full of the most prevalent team comp in the game. While the fact that the buff scales off of how many hits are in your attack, which kind of screws over someone like Ratio, again, the 2-piece effect makes it still pretty nice to farm for him if you're also farming it for someone else. Also, like how I talked about for the Musketeer or the first break set, you can also get Duke pieces at a reduced stamina cost by doing the newer weekly bosses alongside Watchmaker. So I'd count that as a plus, since if you're trying to get the best Duke set possible, being able to occasionally get Watchmaker pieces at the same time at a reduced cost is a very nice bonus. Prisoner, on the other hand, is the premier Dot set, which is great in the sense that it is so uncontested in what it does well, but the downside is that Dot has been so neglected for so long that even though we are so far into this game's lifespan, there is a surprising lack of units who specifically want this set. Still, if your account has Dot, then go for it, and its 2-piece makes it still universal despite how specific its 4-piece is overall. So, not a bad combo of sets in the slightest. I think this Cavern goes into the very high A tier for me. If Dot was given a bit more love so that more units could make use of its 4-piece effect, or if Duke's buffing was a bit more simple for units to achieve, it would for sure go into the S tier. But for now, it's just at the cutoff. If you think it should be in the S tier, that's honestly completely fair. I myself am going back and forth as I write this. For an assured S tier placement, we have the combo of Watchmaker and Pioneer. What's great about the Pioneer set is that not only are there a ton of carries that inflict debuffs naturally, but the 2-piece only stipulates that an enemy is debuffed, which means that any carry can use this 2-piece so long as there are any debuffs being applied from your entire team, which is very likely. Other than that, we are continuing the trend that the Dot set had earlier, in that there are a few specific units that really benefit from this set, mainly Mose, Ratio, and Acheron, while the 2-piece is still universal enough to still be strong outside of those main beneficiaries. What sets this Cavern apart from the previous one, however, is the other set, as while I think Duke is great in how universal it can be, Watchmaker is so far completely uncontested in its niche of buffing break units. The team-wide break effect buff works so well for super break teams where the damage is spread throughout the team, and while the 2-turn buff uptime is a bit shaky, units like Harmony Trailblazer can spam their ults enough for it to have high uptime regardless. Also, as I mentioned in the last Cavern, Watchmaker gets the same points as Duke for being able to be farmed through the limited weekly bosses, as I do think Watchmaker and Duke are the best sets of their respective caverns, so being able to dip your toes into both of them is a nice treat if you are already farming one or both of them. In general, support sets, compared to damaging ones, have a lot less options when it comes to how you are buffing your team, so I think that Watchmaker is overall more important to farm than something like Duke. Since while Duke can be replaced by alternatives for minor damage losses, nothing can replace having a Watchmaker set on your break team. Hopefully that explanation is enough to show why I'm putting this Cavern on the low end of S tier. If the last Cavern was on the cusp of crossing that line, this Cavern is just on the other side of that line, if that makes sense. They are very close in terms of how useful they can be, but Watchmaker's unique strength puts a tier between them in my eyes. We next move on to the Cavern that contains Iron Cavalry and Valoris. To further clarify where I'm coming from, I'm not generally taking into consideration how strong the units are who use these sets. Like, I'm not going to place the Break set higher than the Dot set, just because I think Break is a better team comp than Dot overall. If you're farming for certain units, you're farming for certain units. The tiering more so comes with just how much specific use you can get out of each set. So beyond the sets just being the best for these specific units, a set gets more points for being usable on a lot of units, even if it's not the absolute best set on who you put it on. In that sense, there aren't that many more break carries that use Iron Cavalry compared to the amount of dot carries that can use Prisoner. So while I do think Iron Cavalry is a very strong set, the fact is that it only really benefits your break units and no one else, as opposed to the various other carry sets that have 2 pieces with attack, damage percent, crit, or even flexible 4-piece effects that can all be stretched to be put onto more than just the niche that those sets were made for. The argument that can be made against what I just said is that because you can use this set on any unit on a Super Break team, assuming that they aren't the one using Watchmaker, there are more potential units who can use this set compared to the total amount of dot units who want the Prisoner set. It's not just carries like Firefly or Boothill, but also supports like Lingshaw, Gallagher, or Harmony Trailblazer. The 150% break effect threshold is the only thing really stopping it from being run on absolutely anyone on a break team, but it gives free damage in a comp in which the entire team is supposed to do damage, so that synergy allows for it to ascend past its narrow niche of only being usable on break units and no one else. Valoris, likewise, only has a few units who really want it, but it has that trademark 2-piece attack that makes it not super painful to go for if you are just going for Iron Cavalry. I think A tier is a fair place for this cavern, as while they each have their own set of units who vastly prefer their sets over other options, the lack of a support set to grind for, paired with the comparatively low amount of true Valoris users compared to other damaging sets, puts this cavern in a similar spot to Duke and Prisoner, except without the bonus point of being able to farm one of the sets with weekly bosses. Last but not least, we get to the newest sets, with, well, if you couldn't tell by my wording throughout the video, I really don't know what nicknames people are using for these sets, so I'll refer to them as Scholar and
Sacerdos,
respectively. Sacerdos, in my eyes, is the best support set in the game. As well, its strict-ish condition of only working if your buff is single target makes it a lot less universal than something like Hackerspace. The fact that it gives raw crit damage just makes it so much more valuable than a tiny speed buff that probably won't matter much outside of Apocalyptic Shadow. Even if you're a unit like Bronya or Sparkle that can only proc one of the 2 stacks, that's still damage that you have no other way of replicating right now with other sets. If you have any unit who can use this set, which I mean I know you do because Tingyun is great with using it, I would highly recommend farming for it. It is a completely free way to combat the HP power creep that will remain constant as this game goes on. Scholar, on the other hand, is a pretty decent universal damage set, as its 2-piece crit rate is a much more useful stat than the usual 2-piece attack, as reaching a certain benchmark for crit rate for a carry is usually more important to aim for rather than reaching some arbitrary amount of attack. The 4-piece is only really a standout for specific units, mainly Argenti and Jingliu, but it's good enough with other units that it can be used as a filler set in the same way as the Quantum set, albeit not to the exact same effect. The bottom line is, Scholar is general enough that's not painful going for in the same way that Blade set is when going for Hackerspace. This cavern is really easy to give an S tier to, and I don't think that will really change until we get more offensive support sets that makes the restriction for Sacerdos more relevant through giving it actual competition. And that's the list. Pretty lopsided with how old sets compare to the newer ones, but at the very least, the newer releases are rather equal in strength. It more so just comes down to who you are aiming for, instead of with Simulated Universe worlds, where a lot of the same worlds are directly competing for the same group of units. As you might have been able to tell, ranking these caverns is more so just me splitting hairs, seeing how much worth you get out of these specific sets, which is hard to do since basically every set just has 3 to 5 units who want that specific set over everything else. It's absolutely no coincidence then that the 2 S-tier caverns have support sets in them, as the lack of support set options puts the current options as high priority farm targets. Anyways, thank you for letting me yap for so long about this rather arbitrary list. Thank you very much for watching all the way through this video, and I hope you have a very nice rest of your day. Make sure to subscribe and watch my other vids. Bye!